Prime Minister Narendra Modi has revived a phrase that India had largely left behind after the pandemic. Remember, work from home. Well, amid the deepening West Asia conflict, rising crude oil prices and mounting pressure on the Indian rupee, Prime Minister Modi has urged citizens and companies to cut fuel consumption, avoid non-essential foreign travel, reduce gold purchases and revive remote working wherever possible. Now, what Prime Minister Modi said in Hyderabad on Sunday is what he repeated in Gujarat on Monday. Listen in.
टेक्नोलॉजी की मदद भी हमारे लिए बहुत फायदेमंद होगी। ये जरूरी है कि सरकारी और प्राइवेट दोनों ही दफ्तरों में वर्चुअल मीटिंग्स और वर्क फ्रॉम होम को प्राथमिकता दी जाए। मैं कुछ स्कूलों से भी आग्रह करूंगा कि कुछ समय के लिए ऑनलाइन क्लासेस की व्यवस्था पर काम करें।
Well, Prime Minister Modi's appeal is not merely about lifestyle changes. It is rooted in a growing fear that India, one of the world's largest crude importers, could face a severe economic shock if oil prices remain elevated for months. And that is a real fear. So why does oil matter so much to India? Let's look at the numbers. Well, India imports more than 80% of its crude oil needs. That makes the economy extremely vulnerable whenever conflict disrupts supply chains in West Asia or pushes global crude oil prices sharply higher. Now, this triggers inflation fears and also bodes badly for India's macroeconomics, especially the current account deficit, and imports become much larger substantially than exports in value. Now, the crisis has already triggered visible stress signals. The rupee has fallen to record lows against the US dollar. Brent crude has surged sharply since the Iran conflict escalated. Foreign investors have been pulling money out of Indian markets, and concerns over inflation and widening trade deficits are intensifying. Well, the Indian rupee has become Asia's worst performing currency this year, falling more than 6% in 2026. Analysts warn that if the war intensifies, the rupee could further weaken and move towards the psychologically important 100 per dollar mark. Policy experts say the danger is not just expensive petrol and diesel. In fact, higher oil prices affect almost every layer of India's economy. For example, transport gets more expensive, manufacturing becomes costlier, airlines and logistics firms face margin pressures, food inflation rises due to freight costs, and government finances also come under stress because India spends more dollars on imports. Now, the Observer Research Foundation, or ORF, estimates that every $10 rise in crude prices could widen India's current account deficit by 40 to 50 basis points. HDFC Fund Research estimates that every $10 increase in oil prices could add nearly $18 billion to India's import bill. So why is Prime Minister Modi pushing towards a work-from-home framework one more time? Well, the argument is fairly straightforward. Fewer people commuting means lower fuel consumption. Now, speaking in Hyderabad, Modi urged companies to encourage remote work, virtual meetings, carpooling and public transport use. The logic is partly psychological and partly economic as well. Now, remember, during the COVID-19 years, traffic volumes and urban fuel consumption had fallen sharply. Policymakers now believe selective remote working could again reduce pressure on fuel demand, especially in large cities like Delhi, Bengaluru, Mumbai, as well as Hyderabad, where millions commute for work daily. Now, the government is also trying to avoid harsher measures such as fuel rationing, mandatory restrictions, or sharp hikes in petrol and diesel prices. Now, what is corporate India's response? Well, mixed signals, one could say. Sections of India Inc. appear willing to cooperate with the Prime Minister's appeal. Now, several companies have begun reviving the hybrid work models after Modi's appeal. Industry voices backing the proposal argue that hybrid work can reduce fuel consumption. Virtual meetings cut travel bills, and remote work infrastructure already exists post-pandemic. Some economists have described the move as energy demand management rather than a return to pandemic-style restrictions. Business groups also appear conscious that the government is trying to prevent panic while signaling economic discipline. But not everyone agrees to the Prime Minister's call. Now, some critics argue that work from home may only be a symbolic relief while creating new economic bottlenecks. Opposition leaders have accused the government of shifting the burden of macroeconomic management onto citizens instead of addressing structural energy vulnerabilities. Then there's also skepticism within corporate India itself. Many companies, especially banking, manufacturing, retail, hospitality and traditional services, practically cannot operate remotely at scale. In fact, even IT companies have increasingly pushed employees back to offices over the past 2 years, arguing that productivity, collaboration and workplace culture suffered under prolonged remote work. Commercial real estate firms and urban businesses are also likely to resist any large-scale work-from-home revival because office attendance drives spending across restaurants, transport, retail and services. And then there are some technological and social bottlenecks too. For example, patchy internet infrastructure outside metros, cybersecurity concerns and managerial resistance. Add to that employee fatigue linked to remote work. Now, for smaller businesses, especially MSMEs, work from home is often simply impractical. So, will work from home actually help India save fuel? Well, experts say the answer is partially but not dramatically. Urban commuting does account for substantial fuel usage. A temporary reduction in office traffic could marginally ease petrol and diesel demand, especially if adopted by large IT parks and corporate hubs. But India's oil vulnerability is far bigger than office commutes alone. A large share of imported crude goes into freight movement, aviation, industrial production, agriculture, petrochemicals and electricity-linked sectors. This means remote work alone cannot shield the economy from an oil shock. The deeper challenge remains India's structural dependence on imported energy. The larger signal, Modi's appeal appears designed less on an emergency order and more as a public mobilization exercise. Well, the government wants households and businesses to prepare for a prolonged period of elevated oil prices, imported inflation, currency volatility and tighter economic conditions. The message is also political. Conserve now to avoid harsher disruptions later. Whether corporate India fully embraces another work-from-home phase remains uncertain. Hybrid models may return selectively. But at a full-scale COVID-style remote economy appears unlikely because both businesses and workers have already moved substantially back to office life. So in the short term, work from home may save some fuel, but in the long term, India's real protection against future oil shocks will depend on faster adoption of renewable energy, electric mobility, diversified energy imports, and stronger domestic manufacturing resilience.